The 5th Territorial Force Battalion of the Bedfordshire Regiment was formally created as a Rifle Volunteer Corps in 1860. That said, the local informal volunteer forces, which were the Volunteer Corps' predecessors, existed in the county from the 18th century. To quickly clarify, this video specifically covers the Volunteer Forces history up to 1907. To see the summary of the 5th Territorial Forces Battalion from 1908 onwards, see the link in the description below. Locally organised volunteer forces had been raised on and off around the country for various roles from the 18th century. In 1804, the Volunteer Act created a degree of formality, as at the time almost 400,000 men, close to 18% of men of military service age, were serving in the range of volunteer units. After the Crimean War and Indian mutinies of the 1850s, the British Army underwent a series of reforms, the Volunteers being among those units reorganised over the next few years. Starting in 1859, the Secretary of State authorised the Lord Lieutenants from England, Wales and Scotland to raise volunteer rifle corps in their respective counties, using the 1804 Act as the basis for their formation. A public meeting in Bedford on the 1st of June 1859 saw an initially enthusiastic response, in spite of any volunteers being expected to pay for their own uniforms, rifles and even paying a regular subscription, given that it was ultimately a civil formation. But the plans were stopped in their tracks by an election, and it would not be until November that the first unit was formed in Bedford, with the full complement of 50 volunteers being reached within a week. Although each unit was titled as a corps, they were typically referred to as numbered companies along with a geographical distinction, which, in the case of the Bedfordshire Volunteers, were the towns they were associated to. Each company had a captain in command, a lieutenant acting as a subaltern, and an ensign as the company's junior officer. The 1st Bedford Company was commanded by Captain William Crosby, formerly of the 60th Rifles, with Lieutenant Thomas Jobson Jackson and Ensign James Howard, all from Bedford, completing the company officers. Perhaps not surprisingly, the officers, bar the company ensigns, were prominent, professional, often middle-aged local men. This occasionally attracted the understandable criticism of the Corps being a bit of a boys' club for the officers, which the rank and file had the pleasure of paying for. Leighton Buzzard started raising volunteers on the 2nd of December, and although Mr. William Cooper of Toddington Park started raising the Toddington Company in January 1860, Toddington would become the second company as it was officially authorised soon afterwards, with Leighton Buzzard never getting off the ground after problems with the proposed site of their rifle range. As a result, the Leighton Corps was formed as the 3rd Volunteer Rifle Corps, or the 3rd Company. The 2nd Toddington Company was raised with Major William Cooper, formerly of the Bedfordshire Militia, in command, with 64 men enlisting in the initial wave. Lieutenant John Thomas Green and Ensign Frederick William Green, both of Dunstable, made up the officer complement. A planned corps in Eton Socken also had problems when no suitable storage for rifles could be arranged, so also never got going. 27th of February 1860 saw the battalion's first official commissions issued to the 3 1st Bedford Company officers, Captain Crosby, Lieutenant Jackson and Ensign Howard. The first attestations of the rank and file, also from the 1st Bedford Company, followed soon afterwards, on the 19th of March. April 1860 saw the 4th Company raised in Dunstable under Captain Arthur McNamara of Dunstable, along with Lieutenant William Medland of Houghton and Ensign William Eames from Dunstable completing their officer cadre. The 5th Ampthill Company, which included Silsoe, was also raised that April and commanded by Captain John Hatfield Brooks of Flitwick Manor, formerly of the Bengal Cavalry, along with Lieutenant Francis John Tyne of Haynes Park in Bedford and Ensign Harry Platt of Flitwick. No. 6 Company was formed at the end of April in Luton, whose first 46 volunteers were sworn in on the 30th of May, under Captain John Sambrook Crawley, Lieutenant Edmund Weiss and Ensign Thomas Smith. The Great Review of June 1860 saw 25,000 volunteers march past Queen Victoria, but the Bedfordshire Corps was not represented. The return of strength from the end of that month shows that the county's Volunteer Rifle Corps had not quite managed to reach the minimum requirement of 300 riflemen, which would have enabled it to form the administrative battalion required to formally exist. They were frustratingly short of just 4 men. The only trace of an equivalent event in the county was the day before at Toddington Manor, the residence of the Toddington Company's Captain Cooper, when a general fete was held and a bugle presented to the Toddington Company. In August 1860, the 1st, 2nd, 4th, 5th and 6th Companies were linked into the 1st Administrative Battalion based at Bedford, under their first commanding officer, Major Commandant the Honourable Francis Charles Hastings Russell, MP, having satisfied the administrative requirements. Francis Russell would later become the 9th Duke of Bedford. Later that month, the 7th Company was formed in Biggleswade under Captain Robert Henry Lindsell, who was a retired regular Army Lieutenant Colonel from the 28th Foot, and who owned the home estate of Biggleswade. Lieutenant Frederick Hogg of Biggleswade and Ensign Frederick Gresham of Chicksands formed the rest of the company officers. A month later, Woburn formed the 8th Company, with John Thomas Green being moved into the captaincy from No. 2 Company, and his brother Frederick William Green of Dunstable going with him as the lieutenant, both being residents of Woburn by that time. Henry Russell from Woburn, the son of the commanding officer Francis Russell, became their ensign. On the 11th of October, Major Commandant Francis Russell was promoted to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, although no second-in-command nor adjutant had been appointed. The new 7th and 8th Companies were incorporated into the battalion, with the battalion now fielding over 500 men by the end of October 1860, although the 3rd Leighton Company was still not formed. After repeated unsuccessful wranglings, the Leighton Company withdrew its offer of service, having been unable to secure a suitable site for their rifle range. 1861 proved to be an unsettled year, with the American Civil War and the renewed threat of French invasion. Political conversations started in respect of maintaining the volunteers as a part of the permanent regular army structure, which led to the surprising rise in the number of officers resigning their commissions that spring. At the same time, the Luton Company volunteers made noises that they would stop attending drills unless their officers performed their duties better. As a consequence, their captain, John Sambrook Crawley, resigned, and the company came under close attention of the battalion's recently appointed adjutant, Captain Francis Frederick Richard Mansell Morgan, formerly of the county militia, although it was run on a day-to-day basis by Ensign Coughlin, until Captain Thomas Sauder took over in 1862. March saw the battalion headquarters established at Bedford, although administration was a continuing problem, with the clerk to the lieutenancy, who handled the battalion's administration, breathing fire and slaughter, because the muster rolls of the companies were wholly inaccurate if they'd even arrived. A Royal Commission in 1862 identified that there was an incredible 160,000 men still serving in the Volunteer Rifle Corps, and the following year the Volunteer Act 1863 was introduced to replace the outdated 1804 legislation. On April Fool's Day 1862, the very first of the county's local volunteer reviews took place in Luton, which included the 1st and 2nd Hertfordshire Volunteer Rifle Corps battalions. May of 1862 saw a field day in Cambridge, with the 1st, 5th and 6th Companies representing the county battalion. In October, the entire battalion took part in the next field day, this time in Oxford. June of that year also saw the 9th Company formed at Bedford and attached to the 1st Administrative Battalion the following month. Interestingly, this was comprised entirely of the employees of the Howard Works, later known as the Britannia Iron Works, in Bedford, who wanted to form an artisans' corps. Curiously, no one applied to fill the officer roles, so Lieutenant H. H. Green from No. 1 Company moved into the captaincy, and 2 of the clerks of Messrs. Howard became Lieutenant Charles Johnston and Ensign William Henry Lester. Mid-1863 saw Major Hatfield Brooks, formerly the captain of No. 5 Company, return from his duties in the Bengal Cavalry overseas and resume his volunteer activities. After some debate, he filled the still vacant role of the battalion's second-in-command, also carrying on with the command of No. 2 Ampthill Company that August. Not much of note seems to have happened during the rest of the decade, and at the end of 1870 the battalion's headquarters, which had started life in Bedford before moving to Toddington, was again moved, this time to Woburn. The Luton Company had been without a captain since Thomas Sauder's resignation in 1862, but after some bitter complaining, the company's Lieutenant William Phillips assumed the role, having effectively been in command anyway. The 7th Company headquarters was also moved from Biggleswade to Shefford in March 1871, as the rifle storage arrangements in Biggleswade had deteriorated, and almost all of the officers and men lived in and around Shefford anyway by that stage. The Regulation of the Forces Act 1871 saw the Secretary of State for War take over the administration of the National Volunteer Rifle Corps, and they became more integrated with the regular army. In January 1872, the battalion's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Russell, the adjutant, Captain Francis Morgan, and Luton's commander, Captain William Phillips, all resigned following a disagreement with the War Office. From July 1872, Captain John Thomas Green took command of the battalion, with Captain Edward Jekyll assuming the adjutant's role, and Captain J. M. Webster taking over the adjutant's role from December 1875. Easter Monday of 1877 saw a great review in Dunstable, the battalion having swelled to an impressive 582 volunteers, and in 1878 Luton was granted a 2nd Company after years of effectively being at double strength anyway. That year saw the battalion's return recording the following company structure and company captains. No. 1 Bedford Company under E. R. Green, No. 2 Toddington Company under J. Green, No. 4 Dunstable Company under W. Hambling, No. 5 Ampthill Company under J. C. Campion, No. 6 Luton Company under T. C. Harris, No. 7 Shefford Company under Major H. M. Pryor, No. 8 Woburn Company under T. T. Tanqueray. Interestingly, many of these family names would continue to appear in the regiment over the next 6 decades. 2 years later, the battalion's strength had increased to 653. The Childers reforms of 1881 resulted in the volunteers being merged into the new county regiments, adopting the volunteer battalion structures, uniform and arms styling from their parent regiments. In consequence, the volunteer units of Bedfordshire, Hertfordshire and Huntingdonshire were all amalgamated into the newly formed Bedfordshire Regiment, becoming the 1st Herts Volunteer Battalion, Bedfordshire Regiment, the 2nd Herts Volunteer Battalion, Bedfordshire Regiment, the 3rd Volunteer Battalion, Bedfordshire Regiment, which had previously been the 1st Administrative Battalion of the Bedfordshire Rifle Volunteers, and the 4th Hunts Volunteer Battalion, Bedfordshire Regiment. The companies of the 3rd Bedfordshire Volunteer Battalion were renamed and assigned letters, becoming A and B Companies of Bedford, who were formerly the 1st and 9th Companies, C Company of Toddington, which was formerly the 2nd Company, D Company of Dunstable, which was formerly the 4th Company, E Company of Ampthill, which was formerly the 5th Company, F and G Companies of Luton, which were formerly the 6th Company, H Company of Shefford, which was formerly the 7th Company, and I Company of Oban, which was formerly the 8th Company. In November 1895, Lieutenant Colonel E.R. Green from Bedford's old No. 1 Company took over command from J.T. Green and was in turn superseded in December 1902 by A. Lingard Green. When the South African Wars started in 1899, the volunteers were asked to provide a volunteer service company for overseas service, with 108 men from the 3rd Battalion enrolling instantly, in addition to every last officer from all 4 of the volunteer units. During the wars, 7 officers and 272 of the rank and file, split into 4 drafts, were sent to the 2nd Battalion of the Bedfordshire Regiment who fought in the wars. At 5 a.m. on the 14th of February 1900, the 117 men of the 1st Active Service Company under Captain Lingard Green departed Bedford headed for active service in South Africa on board the SS Grieg. Landing on the 7th of March, they spent a long spell on outpost duty until their baptism of fire on the 22nd of June, which happened to be the same day as the 2nd draft of volunteers under Lieutenant Vesey, who went on to command a company of the regulars during the Great War, arrived as reinforcements. They dislodged the Boer troopers from their defensive positions for the cost of 1 officer badly hit and a further 5 ranks wounded. Coming under both sniper and volley fire daily during a long march over the next week, they also saw their first taste of artillery fire before a stint on outpost duty around Wingburg followed. On the 29th of July, the volunteers formed the right part of a British assault, followed by more outpost rolls around Wingburg. August also saw them engage with the 2nd Bedfordshires in holding the Boer assault on Wingburg, the volunteers working around the right flank to help surround the attackers and force their surrender. From October they spent a monotonous 7 months guarding a 6-mile-long line around Alexandra and Springham, with only occasional contact with Boer troops breaking their tedium, and the sighting of a distant column of around 1,200 Boers mid-November. The 2nd Active Service Company, also referred to as the 3rd Draft, given that the 2nd Draft were purely reinforcements, was comprised 84 men under 2nd Lieutenants Rakes and Collett, and left Bedford on the 16th of March 1901, setting sail the following day. On arrival in South Africa they joined the 1st Company, although 93 of the remaining 113 men from the original company left South Africa on the 22nd of April on board the SS St Andrew. Their commander, Captain Lingard Green, would be awarded the DSO for his part in the operations. 9 men from the rank and file of the 1st Active Service Company were recorded as having died from illness during the wars. Back in South Africa, the 2nd Active Service Company moved to Sanna's Post after 6 weeks of outpost duties, tasked with keeping the lines of communication open between their post and Bloemfontein for the entirety of their service, until returning to England in March 1902. Other than a handful who were assigned to mounted infantry roles, the company saw no hostile action whatsoever, although 2 men still died from illness. The 2 officers and 60 men left with the 2nd Volunteer Company landed at Southampton on the 25th of April and received the same enthusiastic welcome back in Bedford that the 1st Company had enjoyed. The 4th Draft, which was in reality the 3rd Active Service Company, under Lieutenant Brighton, sailed to South Africa on board the SS Cawdor Castle on the 15th of February 1902, disembarking on the 9th of March. While being transported to Bloemfontein, their train was involved in an accident, and although the Bedfords came out with just bumps and bruises, 1 man from the Argyll and Sutherland Highlander Volunteers was killed. Joining the 2nd Battalion of the Bedfordshires a week later, 10 of them were posted as mounted infantry, the rest occupying the blockhouses and guarding their assigned areas. Uneventful weeks of providing guards for convoys and manning their posts followed, before peace was declared. The 24th of June saw the 3rd Active Service Company, or the 4th Draft, board the SS Walmer Castle and set sail for home shores after their spell of 4 months in South Africa. Among those who volunteered in January 1899 was a young solicitor called Lieutenant Edgar William Brighton, who would go on to have a long and distinguished military career within the regiment, commanding the 5th Territorial Battalion throughout Gallipoli and the Egypt-Palestine campaigns of the Great War, before being promoted to command the 2nd Regular Battalion between the First and Second World Wars. Other than the strength of the volunteers being increased between 1903 and 1907, and 24 volunteer battalions being involved in regular army manoeuvres, the period was quiet and the battalion turned to its entirely civic condition and activities. The battalion's final commanding officer before the volunteer force ceased to exist was Lieutenant Colonel Spencer Jackson, who would carry his command over into the newly formed Territorial Force. In April 1908, Haldane's reform saw the end of the volunteer force and the formation of a Territorial Force.